This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the 24th Bioequity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Simeon George, CEO and Managing Partner of the venture firm SR1. Simeon co-founded SR1 Capital Management following its spin-out from GSK in 2020. He'd, of course, been part of the team there for over a decade. Simeon had previously worked in management consulting at Bain and investment banking at Goldman Sachs. Simeon, we're going to get into some of the issues around creating SR1, but I actually want to start with setting the stage with what you talked to me about last week. Everybody thinks about the capital markets, and we'll get to that later, but you immediately indicated to me that you are very enthusiastic, that this is an amazing time to be investing in biotech. And, I have the pleasure of being one of the last episodes of the year of the BioCentury Show. So things are not great overall in the world right now. So give us some optimism. What are you excited about and why?
Yeah, thank you. And Simone, thanks for having me on the show. This is a great avenue to be able to share ideas, and I look forward to the conversation and also listening to previous interviews you've done. And hopefully you'll get a similar feel around the fact that it is an incredible time from the standpoint of the clinical impact that we're able to have with these amazing medicines that are coming forward. And we're talking today at the time when the ASH conference is going on in San Diego, and just seeing, I'm not there today, but just seeing and reading about the updates that we're seeing, some of them from our own companies, including Arcellx presenting today and CRISPR over the weekend. It truly is the stuff that, like, going back to when I trained as a physician, the reason why I chose this occupation is to have this patient impact. And you're seeing this amazing medicines coming forward. And just examples quickly to touch on, this data around how do you use cell therapy now moving from cancer into the autoimmune setting, and seeing some of the data in lupus as an example. I mean, some of these pictures, they truly are worth 1,000 words in terms of before and after with a CD19 directed cell therapy for diseases outside of cancer. And then again, Arcellx today presenting their autologous CAR T therapy, which showing again market response rates, now out over 2 years in terms of the duration of the response, the clinical benefit you're seeing to these patients. That is ultimately why, at least for me, that's why we do the work that we do. And of course, on Friday, we had the approval of exa-cel, the CRISPR Vertex gene medicine, genetic editing medicine, which again, the first of its kind, which potentially offers a transformative cure for patients that suffer from sickle cell disease, right? These are things that when I was training, you had to spend time worrying about how do you manage these sick patients that are coming in every month or two with these vaso-occlusive crises from their sickle cell. Now you have potentially a treatment that can essentially avoid them having to come and have those episodic events, right? So this is why, to me, it's an amazing time to be in biotech, investing in biotech, building companies, ultimately with the lens of, can we have a patient impact with the products we're bringing forward?
Well, we're going to get back into some of those areas. It certainly is an exciting time from a innovation perspective, and that at BioCentury is core to what we do and what we care about. But I also think that an important part of this process, of this ecosystem, is the creation of new venture firms. This, of course, is the capital that fuels that innovation at the very early end. Now, for the audience that doesn't know the origins of SR1, you did a rare or maybe even unique thing in spinning out from GSK, where SR1 was the corporate venture arm. You announced your first fund in 2020 of about $500 million, and second this April, $600 million. Now, tell us a little bit about that process. And in particular, you've had 3, maybe nearly 4 years. What have you learned in that time?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Simone. It's one of those things where when we were going through it, it felt like it was going to happen. We believed in ourselves, our track record, all of these, again, great things that, again, have proven to be true. But actually, the reality is it is a fairly rare, if not singular event in terms of being able to create this sort of independent firm coming out of a large corporate setting. And so, the history of SR1, again, just to level set for the audience, the fund was set up in the mid 1980s. At the time when the precursor company to GSK, SmithKline and French, had all of, quite a lot of excess free cash from their products, and this new field of biotech was emerging, and so they started investing essentially out of this vehicle to get access to some of the early innovation. And over the course of the next 35 years, the fund was successful investing off of the balance sheet of GSK, essentially investing for financial return. And as you noted, I was with GSK, and the core group of us that spun out had been together for over a decade investing off of GSK's balance sheet. And, we had developed, the track record, the level of sort of camaraderie and ability to work together to source and diligence and invest and exit companies. And so we believed in ourselves, and we believed, again, as I said up front, it's a great time to be investing in biotech. And we had the strong support of GSK to be able to go out and raise third-party capital and bring in other investors who could help build and scale the business over time. And as you noted, about 3.5 years ago now, we did separate from GSK. We've now raised two venture funds. We have, I think, over 1.5 billion assets under management. We've brought on some really significant investors, whether it's pension funds, endowments, fund of funds, sovereign wealth funds, large family offices, in addition to the continued support of GSK. So GSK has continued to support us through these new funds. And so we're certainly extremely grateful for the support that the team there, in particular, David Redfern and Emma, have put in myself and my team. And so, so that's the first part, is like there was this long history. We'd worked together and we built this new firm, and it had a lot of the same ingredients of what had made us successful. That's what we came to market with, which is the idea of focusing on ultimately bringing important medicines forward. And really, the last 3 years have been an extension or maybe acceleration of that track. And so what I mean by that is we have the capital now through these new funds, but we've really added some incredible capabilities, in particular, members of my team who have joined, who can really, in my opinion, help companies realize their full potential. And so folks on my team, such as Chris Chai, who is a serial chief financial officer, who can really work with entrepreneurs and startups to help them think about building out their finance function, help them think about how to build out their investor base, go from, private all the way through later stage private rounds into the public markets. And that's an invaluable experience to have on our team that our entrepreneurs can access and use as a resource. And so that's one way that I think we're adding a dimension to our companies and their ability to be successful. And maybe the second, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. Then the second way is really augmenting Chris on the business development, the pharma engagement side. We've added Iqbal Mufti, who has joined us after a 20+ year career at Roche, really to focus on, again, how do small company startups think about the interaction with pharma, how to develop the relationships, how do they position themselves? And we feel, again, everything that we can do beyond just the access to the capital is a way for us to, frankly, enable the companies and the entrepreneurs to be successful. So we're really leaning into that in a way that, frankly, wasn't possible while we were part of GSK.
Right. And you also, let's, be honest, you launched at the height of the bull market, and now it's the opposite, let's say. Have you adjusted your strategy, or if so, how have you adjusted it?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the beauty of this team in particular, think about, I joined in 2007. So those first few years post GFC, the way that we thought about investing, sort of the focus on the fundamentals, capital efficiency, those are the same ideas that we have leaned on even during the bull periods. And now, as you say, we're certainly back to that narrative. And so, we had an offsite recently, and we were talking about, one of our big success stories has been Principia Biopharma. We were one of the co-lead in the Series A investments, and I was involved in the company all the way through not only the company going public, but ultimately through the sale of Sanofi for 3.7 billion a couple of years back. And if you look at the history of that company, no story is linear. There's always challenges along the way. And what separated that company and the ethos around which that company was built is exactly what we apply now. So they were capital efficient, they syndicated, they brought in, the Series A was four-handed deal with 3 other investors alongside SR1. They did 2 partnerships. They took, I think, 5 programs from start all the way through to into clinical development. And ultimately, they transacted. And when they had gone public, if I'm getting the numbers right, I think they had raised somewhere between 200 to 300 million of private capital, and then they had raised some additional amount in the public markets. And so this idea of capital efficiency, productivity, really driven by the R&D engine, going from science to medicine, de-risking through partnerships. These are the same traits that today should resonate with the startups that we're working with. And so, we're sort of going back to basics, if you will, in the way that we're approaching our job now.
Right. Well, you're talking about non-linear paths. So, for example, do you think differently about allocating reserve money? Have you built more additional financing rounds for your portfolio companies into the model now?
To be fair, Simone, we were actually always quite pragmatic about the need to have reserves for the early stage companies. And in general, that we haven't changed the way we think about that. If anything, we're much more mindful, probably on 2 dimensions. So the first is really being thoughtful around the quality of the syndicate, not only just in terms of deep-pocketed investors, but really alignment around what are the key de-risking, value-creating steps, and how much capital is going to be required to get from point A to point B. And when you get to point B, having some sense that there is, assuming the companies, again, is tracking, is executing, there will be continued support from these inside investors. So that's the second piece, is this idea that we probably have to support the companies longer. There might be another private round before you can go public, or maybe it's before your next value creating event. And so we really are honing in on that now and focus a lot of the time and effort. And I mentioned Chris's role. It really is to interrogate and to make sure that we are setting the company up for success, not just for today, but planning for the future in terms of the capital build and requirements.
I'm going to come back to that thread. We'll take a short break now. And when we come back, we'll talk more about this and what the next year's got in store and what areas Simeon and SR1 are watching.
For more than 20 years, BioEquity Europe has been where CEOs and investors gather to network, partner, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. In 2024, BioEquity heads to San Sebastian, Spain, in Basque Country, May 12th to 14th. Join BioCentury, EBD Group, and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital in one of the world's culinary capitals for a destination event designed for CEOs, investors, and decision-makers across the global biopharma ecosystem. In 2023, 300 VCs and 330 biotech CEOs joined BioEquity in Dublin, Ireland. In San Sebastian, the program will feature more than 100 emerging biotechs that will present their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, last year's BioEquity conference sold out. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
I am back with Simeon George at the BioCentury Show, and we're talking about sort of the next era. Let's talk about 2024 and investing, certainly in private companies. So I do want to raise something. You talked about the sort of diligence that you're going to be going through with companies that you create or fund, in this more capital restrained era. There's also a lot of talk about too many companies having been created in the bull years. Many people think that wasn't good for biotech, or that there are too many companies that shouldn't be companies out there. So can you talk a little bit about whether, not only in your own firm, but among the people you syndicate with, other VCs, do you see really different criteria being applied?
The new investments.
In terms of company creation, let's say.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, listen, there's, there isn't a one size fits all with the various firms. Certainly from our standpoint, we remain committed to early stage, whether it's company creation, seed rounds, Series A investments. And we talk a lot about this journey of science to medicine and wanting to enable the companies to sort of have that full experience of what that arc looks like and everything that we can do to support them on that. And I brought up the example with our team, both CRISPR and Arcellx. So CRISPR, we led the Series A investment. Arcellx, we are the co-founders of that company. Those companies started essentially as science on a napkin when we invested, right? So you have to start somewhere, in my opinion, right? To be able to then follow science, be on the sort of the cutting edge of what's happening, the innovation lens. Even if you're looking at later stage deals, it helps it's invaluable to have that expertise and understanding of what's happening as you think about sort of competitive profiles, differentiation, all of those things. So we're committed to doing it for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is we believe you can generate outsized returns, and those companies that I've mentioned are examples of that. But the way that we do it, I think, has to be now pressure tested, because again, the assumption is the markets are going to continue to remain challenging, whether it's 24, 25, 26, I think everyone can crystal ball. But for us, it's really around, if we're going to do this, let's do this in a way that makes sense and is fit for purpose. And so some of the same ideas around efficiency of the business model, again, this idea of a path to value creation that we can quantify so we understand how much capital is required. We can think through selection criteria in terms of what are the set of applications we want to go after. We can think through syndication. How much do we want to expose to SR1 alone versus working alongside one or two other investors? And most importantly, right now, for me at least, is we can think through who are the credible scientists, founders, entrepreneurs that we want to entrust with these sorts of opportunities at this stage. And there is a premium in my mind for people that have understood how to build and create and scale companies across market cycles right now. And so, the examples in on our team right now, Rodger Novak, again, co-founder and CEO of CRISPR, then chairman of CRISPR, we're working with him in Europe on two new startups that, again, high science, where, again, without his experience, leadership, and understanding, I'm not sure we would necessarily have done those company creation events. And then Elliot Charles, who, in addition to being the Principia co-founder, also was co-founder of MiroBio, one of our successes from Fund One, a UK company that within 3 years essentially went from spinning technology out of Oxford University, setting up an incredible research team and hub in Oxford, executing on a plan, moving programs forward from research into preclinical, and ultimately we transacted to Gilead last summer, because of the interest in what we were doing. And so I think those are the different pieces that we really are going to focus on now: quality of the science, quality of the entrepreneur, and a lean and mean business plan around which you can continue to build and create value.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of risk management. First of all, it does sound like it's going to be not a great era for first-time CEOs, that we're looking more for seasoned people. I also want to ask you about, how much you care about first in class. Is that, is that something that, for you to go down the road of wanting a first-in-class asset, or to build a company pursuing a first-in-class asset, you have to be assured of so many things? And the case is best-in-class a more risk comfortable area where you think that you and others can really deliver returns and value to patients? What does this mean for innovation is what I'm really talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe just on the first point around first-time CEOs, I would actually disagree with that. I mean, and myself in particular, I am actually quite keen and motivated to back first-time CEOs. The cases of company creation that I mentioned with Rodger and Elliot, in general, the way these have been set up is they usually come in as like executive chairman, and then over time we hire a CEO. And I actually personally believe it's hard to beat the motivation of a first-time CEO that wants to prove his or her, colors and how good they are and whatever else. And I've done this, over the course of my career. In general, I think I've backed more first-time CEOs than repeat entrepreneurs. So I do believe firmly in that, like people that are motivated, that clearly understand what they know and what they don't know, and how you can augment their the gaps there. Like I'm all for that. I love that experience of working with motivated young CEOs. I'm working with one now, Yasser Al-Wakil, is a first-time CEO that we're working on with a new company that we led the Series A in that hasn't yet been announced, but someone that I've known over the last few years and have believed with all my heart that he was ready to be CEO. Probably told him that before he was even willing to do that. So like, I guess I want to make sure that the audience knows, like, we love first-time CEOs and entrepreneurs.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's, yes, I think, an important point. Yeah. Let's talk about first in class, best in class.
Yes. So I think, again, I don't think there's, for us, certainly it doesn't have to be first in class for us to say this is the only way we're going to invest behind this. There is certainly a thesis for best in class. And again, I think the contours of what that look like are clearly going to be defined by what is standard of care currently, what is, where's the goalpost for where you're trying to get to, and developing a degree of confidence around the profile of the molecule, the medicine, the asset, and what is it going to take from a development standpoint to really prove out that approach. And we've done that. Certainly, I think probably Turning Point, the investment that, again, we co-led the Series C of, which ultimately was around repotrectinib, this ROS1 inhibitor. At the time, there was at least a couple of other ROS1 programs. Ignita had a ROS1 program, entrectinib, that ultimately got acquired by Roche and was actually approved before the Turning Point drug. But we had a clear view on the properties of this molecule, the differentiation around both in terms of efficacy and safety profile. And ultimately, the belief was that with clinical data, we can prove that out and we can push the molecule forward. And ultimately, the molecule was just approved. BMS got the approval in November of this year. So there is a path forward for best in class. As on the first in class front, again, like of course, that's music to the ears of venture capitalists. Like the idea of being first and that you're in a white space where you can basically create the market opportunity. There are the challenges there around, again, ensuring that you're holding yourselves accountable to, again, ultimately what is still a differentiated profile for the disease burden. And so being first in class, but not actually meeting the clinical needs of what the patients are, isn't that satisfying either, right? So I think for us, innovation can come through ultimately the patient impact that we're going to have. And whether it's first in class or best in class, I think we can be flexible and ultimately we'll pressure test those assumptions.
I want to dig into a few specific areas now and ask you how you're thinking about precision medicine outside of cancer. The reason I ask is, this field seems to be in a little bit of flux. There are some areas that really seem to need segmenting of populations, like Alzheimer's disease, neuropsych, a few others. But at the same time, we hear a tremendous pressure towards going after large addressable markets, large TAMs, total addressable markets, and in a way that really runs counter to the precision medicine narrative or the precision narrative. How do you pass this? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, again, I'm not sure there's, for us, we look at opportunity sets that probably cross the spectrum here. So the beauty, as you see, of precision medicine, certainly in oncology, we've seen this, is the ability to have an efficient path to identify patients with the signature of the mutations, develop molecules that are exquisitely selective, show the clinical utility, and with a handful of patients, convince ourselves, investors, regulators, pharma, that there's a meaningful, we're meeting the unmet need of the clinical burden, but we now have a path towards regulatory and commercialization of that product. And that has been successful. Certainly, I mentioned Turning Point, a good example of that. I think that model still exists. Certainly in oncology, I think it's become more crowded because, to your last question, people have decided to go after the same targets with molecules that look more like me too than they do differentiated or best-in-class molecules, right? So I think some of this needs to be sort of expectation setting around. In the personalized medicine approach, you still need to have a clear rationale for why this molecule is going to stand up against whatever else is in development or commercialized. I think outside of oncology, I do think it's interesting. I mean, we are seeing, you mentioned some of the areas, for example, whether it's neuropsych or neurodegenerative diseases, and now targets that appear to be exquisitely sensitive and specific to disease conditions, where, again, the idea is if you can develop molecules, you might be able to segment a population and, at least as an initial proof point, have a way to build the data set, and then over time, potentially to your point also, move into larger markets. And so certainly market size and TAMs are important, but what's more important than that is actually having a drug that's working in patients, that's proving out the clinical benefit and is having that impact. And so I think there's ways to be precise around that. The idea of going into larger markets, it's certainly with all the excitement around the obesity drugs, certainly getting people's attention. But I also think in the context of a venture model for a startup, to start with a narrow focus that's defined by certain specific genetic characteristics or biological characteristics that are quite precise and segment, that's actually a pretty reasonable way for companies to be building value in the near to midterm.
Well, let's go from there to, you raised gene editing at the beginning, which really, saw a tremendous milestone last week. I think it is maybe 10 or 11 years after that first publication, maybe in one of the few really, really white space areas where there just wasn't something and it went to a drug in a decade. And I think that is a really remarkable achievement, actually, for the field altogether. How do you think this plays out going forward? There are obviously still a lot of hurdles with gene editing, and whether it's ex vivo or in vivo, there still are a lot of safety concerns and limitations, and that's before we even talk about the commercial ones. How are you looking at this? Is this an area you're going to continue to delve into, or are you sort of going to wait to let the field mature? What's the path now?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a really important proof point. I think you mentioned it, like to go in a little over a decade from science to medicine, right? Like that truly is, it sounds too good to be true. Like it sounds like something we talk about rewriting the medical textbooks. I think that's what this first proof point for sickle cell and beta thal has shown. And I think hopefully we are now at a point where this is just the start, right? I think we have to probably temper expectations around how long this might take and the challenges around delivery and our understanding of how these systems work when you move from DNA to RNA to epigenetic editing to base editing. Like there's so many different tools right now that people are trying, and I believe that there's a very good likelihood that a number of them are going to be successful, but it requires, again, that same sort of starting with patient impact and working backwards, product focus, execution focus, and picking the right sets of indications to exemplify. And so for us, we are absolutely committed to this area. I mentioned we've made a new investment. We haven't yet announced it, but it's in an area that really is focused on one of the key unlocks for this whole field. And it's around how do you deliver whole genes in vivo, and how do you essentially have a technology that can allow for that, whether it's small genes or larger genes, of course, more challenging. And so it's really focusing on technologies that can essentially get around some of those key hurdles, right? That's one example. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of interest on the in vivo CAR T side as another example. We're seeing tremendous progress ex vivo. Can you do it now in the body? And there's companies that are starting to develop, at least preclinically, an interesting data set. And there's questions around durability and indication selection, but I believe something likely comes out of that. And then we talked at the front about moving beyond cancer now into autoimmune disease. And again, I think the data, the lupus data and where that's going to go. And, a company that we're co-founders of, Nkarta, is working on NK cell therapy going after, autoimmune indications now. And so I do think this field, over the next 5-10 years, Simone, like I would be disappointed if when we're talking again, there hasn't been more progress made on the next set of applications. Certainly the medical need is there. And whether it's, again, in rare disease setting or potentially going after some of the larger indications, whether it's diabetes or others, where again, there's clearly the massive market opportunity. This is where we need to try and test these hypotheses and these technologies. And again, focus on what is the ultimate clinical benefit for patients.
So, talking about the CAR-Ts in lupus and autoimmune disease, which is obviously incredibly interesting and exciting potential, but it also sort of could be facing a setback with the news last week from FDA about concerns over mutagenesis. How are you digesting that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think this concern is something that has been well known and documented as one of the theoretical risks when you're working with technologies like this, the idea of insertional mutagenesis or other sort of off-target effects that are leading to malignancies. This certainly has been a concern, certainly for us, for companies, for the regulators. The reality is, we're talking about the announcement you mentioned is citing a very small number in the context of the overall clinical impact that we're seeing with these therapies, certainly in the hematologic malignancies. When you think about risk reward and the ability to essentially transform a patient's life by the remission of their cancer versus a very rare set of these off-target.
In autoimmune disease, do you think that the risk
sorry.
is different there?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, again, it comes down to risk reward here. And so my bias or hypothesis will be we are going to start with the sickest patients within the autoimmune disease setting, right? That are failing prior therapies that frankly are in life-threatening situations. That's where we're going to first start to evaluate, and hopefully the data that we're seeing at ASH will continue to replicate, and you'll have products that are moving forward. And then over time, we're going to have to find ways to be more stringent on how we're evaluating some of these off-target effects to be able to hopefully catch them sooner rather than later. And then again, assuming that risk-reward balance maintains in the patient's favor, we should see, even in autoimmune disease, I believe we'll see therapies moving earlier in terms of the lines of when they might receive the therapy. But I do think fundamentally, like, the ability to have these dramatic patient responses, like we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about, certainly with any treatment, there's a risk benefit to it when we're considering administering it to the patient.
Well, we're actually out of time. This is fascinating. We could probably talk a lot more about it, and hopefully we will do again in the future. But yeah, you've talked about a lot of the very exciting things that are happening. None of it happens without some risks. So it'll be certainly an area that we will continue to watch. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Simone. Thanks for this opportunity. Appreciate the chance. Thank you.
Brought to you by the 24th BioEquity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.